In the 1940s, psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark designed and conducted a series of experiments known colloquially as the doll tests to study the psychological effects of segregation on African American children. The Clarks used 4 dolls, identical except for color, to test children's racial perceptions. Their subjects, children between the ages of 3 to 7, were asked to identify both the race of the dolls and which color doll they prefer. A majority of the children preferred the white doll and assigned positive characteristics to it. The Clarks concluded that prejudice, discrimination, and segregation created a feeling of inferiority among African American children and damaged their self-esteem. The dolls were part of a group of groundbreaking psychological experiments by this husband and wife team of African American psychologists. They devoted their life's work to understanding and helping heal children's racial biases. During the doll tests, as they're now known, a majority of African American children showed a preference for dolls with white skin instead of black ones. A consequence, the Clarks would argue, were the effects of segregation. The Clarks doll test was one of the main pieces of scientific evidence that was the basis for the Brown versus Board of Education case that ruled in 1954 that segregated schools were illegal. The results of the Clark study showed the devastating effects of life in a society that was intolerant of African Americans. The test involved white and brown-skinned dolls, and it was deceptively simple. It's worth noting that at that time, the Clarks had to paint a white baby doll brown for the tests, since African American dolls were not yet manufactured. During the test, the children were asked to identify the diaper dolls in a number of ways. The one they wanted to play with, the one that looked white, the one that looked colored or Negro, and the one that was a good or a bad doll. Finally, they were asked to identify the doll that looked most like them. All of the children tested were black, and all but one group attended segregated schools. Most of the children preferred the white doll to the African American one. Some of the children would cry and run out of the room when asked to identify which doll looked like them. These results upset the Clarks so much that they delayed publishing their conclusions. A stereotype threat is a situational predicament in which people either are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to stereotypes about their social group. Stereotype threat is a widely studied topic in the field of social psychology. It's been shown to reduce the performance of individuals who belong to negatively stereotyped groups. The theory suggests that if negative stereotypes are present regarding a specific group members are likely to become anxious about their performance, which then may hinder their ability to perform at their maximum level. What is important to know is that the individual does not need to subscribe to the stereotype for it to be activated. It's hypothesized that the mechanism through which anxiety, which is induced by the activation of the stereotype, decreases performance by depleting working memory. That means that someone will have problems recalling information they actually know due to the anxiety that is created by the stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is a potential contributing factor to long-standing racial and gender gaps in academic performance. Since most people have at least one social identity which is negatively stereotyped, most people are vulnerable to stereotype threat if they encounter a situation in which the stereotype is relevant. Defensive othering refers to the actions performed by those seeking membership and acceptance in a dominant group that involves distancing themselves from other members of their own subordinate group. An example of this would be when someone in a minority group treats people from their own group the way a dominant group member would treat them. It's a way of deflecting stigma. Rather than resisting and rejecting the power of the stigma, they engage in defensive othering. Subordinates are distancing themselves from other subordinates and reinforcing the legitimacy of a devalued identity in the process. This occurs because the minority group member has internalized the cultural messages of the dominant group. Internalized oppression affects how non-whites view their own culture through the lens of stereotypical, narrow, pathological, and seemingly authentic culture and behavior. These are perceptions informed by the white supremacist culture of the dominant group. For example, Asian American students may feel pressure to be overachievers as a result of the dominant group's perception of Asian Americans as good students, the model minority. If they're unable to live up to this false stereotype, they may feel embarrassed or depressed about their academic performance. Because white standards of beauty are imposed in our society, this leads people who have other characteristics to change their own natural features. Examples of this are changing hair texture or lightening skin tones, or surgical procedures to change eyelids, lips, and noses. Each racial category has a certain level of prevalence of surgical interventions. Asians tend to have eyelid surgery more often. Blacks and African Americans tend to have nose and lip reduction surgeries more often. This is a result of internalized oppression, trying to conform to the white standards of beauty.